All right, thank you. Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad that we are here and doing this tonight. A big thank you to Greg and Michael, who, along with Rose and a number of other pretty extraordinary people, helped put this together tonight. So we're really grateful. Thank you both for taking the time to come out
Thanks for having us.
and have dinner with me and sit here and schmooze for a little bit about Jews and superheroes. So. Okay, so obviously we've all done a lot of research to prepare for tonight. I have been lectured privately by a number of people in our community who happen to take a particular interest in this. You guys have poured over all of my sermons, podcast and written form, so we know a lot about each other now. What I would love to do is just start a conversation, and then we really are eager to hear from all of you, in which we can create a space to hear from both of you about what this fascination is with superheroes that has taken over American culture for the greater part of a century, and what the particularly Jewish connection is to it. So, in a private history lecture from Greg and Barry. So I learned a little bit about this history, which to my mind before that was just a kind of the fascination of my young son. But actually, it's pretty fascinating. And so I don't know how many of you know this. So I'm going to just I'll lay out the basics, and then I'm going to just ask you to just jump in and take over. Which is, it seems that almost all of the early superhero creators were Jews, many of them Jewish Depression era kids who were struggling with their own sense of vulnerability, of weakness in the early 30s, and then later as the Holocaust sort of gripped Europe in an ever greater urgency to attach themselves to a fantastic vision of what real power might look like. And so many of these writers were Jewish, but also a lot of the themes are very Jewish. And that's one of the things that I'd like for us to be able to talk about a little bit as we go on. And now, obviously, the two of you who are seen as kind of heirs to this, to the legacy that a lot of these great writers have laid out before. I wonder if you can talk just a little bit, brief us about what you see the connection between this genre and our shared Jewish heritage and tradition. Let's start there.
You start. Always let
That's a
the
softball.
academic start.
That's
Did you hear all the degrees he has? It's very impressive.
Yeah. So for me, it's very personal. I'm actually not going to try to play the academic here and give any kind of objective overview. It's very personal, and it starts with being, attracted to and totally mixed up about this stuff that was, fell into my lap as a kid. And I was looking at comic books, in the early 70s, often as I don't know if Damon can second this, but you weren't always necessarily looking at new comic books. You're often looking at tattered copies that were sort of passed around, or that somebody's older brother had, or you bought on a sidewalk or on a stoop, and these things were trickling into your consciousness in a kind of a subterranean way. They weren't sanctioned as culture. They, except for Batman, who was on TV in this very campy way. They weren't, there weren't big movies opening in the summer. There weren't graphic novels that won Pulitzer Prizes. There was no place in which they seemed to be part of the official or the adult cultural sphere. They were this kind of strange, talismanic garbage that floated around. And yet everybody knew them. At the same time, there was this way in which they were very hoary, or you were always coming late to the story. Superman and Batman especially had this quality of being these sort of archetypal figures that were already tattered or secondhand or in disrepair by the time they got to you. So for me, I quickly figured out that the Marvel comics that I thought were cooler, and these are the characters that now happen to dominate our culture, Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four and Thor and Hulk. For whatever reason, that kit of images and ideas seemed much hipper and more my own. Superman and Batman were a little worn out. Although I did of course, have to respond to them. But the other thing that really mattered to me about the Marvel comics, again, it was like a pre-conscious experience of identification without understanding that it was particular. I'm working my way to the Jew part of this, is that the Marvel comics were written and made in New York City, not just by, immigrant Jews, aspirant, lower middle class, second generation guys, but they referred to New York City and to that experience. Spider-Man was from Queens, and the Thing from the Fantastic Four came from a neighborhood from Yancey Street. And there were these like references to the city that I was living in that seemed very knowing and very urbane and very insiderish.
And it was New York. There is no New York in DC.
That's right. They always used a kind of generic analog, Gotham or Metropolis. But here it really was New York City. And so these guys, Jack Kirby, who had renamed himself, and Stan Lee, who had renamed himself, these were like guys who I could relate to. They were like my uncles making comic books. And I didn't have to figure that out. I could just absorb it as a sensory piece of information. That there was something familiar and funny and tribal about the gang of guys and the way they felt about American life. That they were having fantasies about it, but they were also not completely inside it. And it's not so different in a way from the way that Jews created the Hollywood image that became classical Hollywood. In so many ways, it was about fantasizing about an American ideal or an American dream, an idealization that was not completely accessible to the people who were making it. So, you could think in a way that Cary Grant is a superhero. His lines being written by Jewish guys who can't be Cary Grant, and his scenes being directed, by Jewish guys who can't be Cary Grant. Well, Superman is another version of that.
I think that I had a very similar experience and trajectory that Jonathan did, and I do think that it's the textbook example of our generation. In terms of growing up in the 70s and into the 80s, the Star Wars generation, if you will, because, I only mention that movie because I do feel it was one of the defining cultural events of our childhood and was happening at roughly the same time as delving into comic books. So one of the first comic books that I was reading was the Star Wars comic, which came out in 1978 or 1979, and the first comic. My father was an avid collector of comic books from when he was a kid, and what happened, what his origin story, as it were, was when he was 11 years old, he went to Boy Scout camp. And when he came back, his mom had had thrown away his entire comic book collection, and he was this kind of fierce archivist. So he had these composition notebooks where he had logged every comic book that he owned, and then took it upon himself, starting at age 11, to basically reconstitute the collection. And so I remember as a 9-year-old and 10-year-old going into the city with my dad, going to comic conventions when they were really not cool. I mean, they're still like, now it's kind of like they're sort of cool, but if you're going there to buy comics, not cool. But with literally these lists that he would hand me, and I would search around, asking, soliciting from very strange adult males, do you have, Walt Disney's Comics and Stories number 232? and if I could find it, I'd go back to my dad. So he was reconstituting his collection. So my gateway drug was really the Karl Barks kind of Disney but then I started getting into superhero books. And oddly enough, the DC books that I was reading were there was a comic called Lois Lane, Superman's girlfriend, and Jimmy Olsen, Superman's pal.
Right.
Superman's pal. And I was fascinated by these books because Superman kind of just fucking fly in at the end. Like they would construct these entire stories that were all sort of built around Jimmy Olsen just kind of being like, hey, but do you know that I'm Superman's pal? Like, and it was oddly accessible because he didn't have any abilities, or almost every Jimmy Olsen Superman's pal story would be that he would gain finite abilities for just that issue. So he would like sneak into the Fortress of Solitude, shout out, and he would like steal something from Superman's collection that would give him elasticity or invisibility or gigantism, until Superman busted him and was like, Jimmy, did you find my giganto ring? So there was this sort of like, there was this interesting, and I do think that this relates somewhat to the Jewish experience of sort of like you wanting to be Superman but not being able to stay Superman, but Superman still kind of tolerating you. So there was this sort of, this wish fulfillment aspect to it. And the Lois Lane stories were intensely misogynistic through hindsight, but if you're looking for like a good laugh, you can go on the web and just basically look at covers of Lois Lane, like Superman's girlfriend, and they're like the most out there crazy ideas. But that was sort of like, that's kind of how I got into Superman, and then I made the shift into Marvel books. And I think that for me it was Spidey, but then also the X-Men.
Yeah, of course.
And I think that for those of you who are unfamiliar with the X-Men are mutants. So they are unlike the superheroes in the DC universe, who and Spidey is an outlier on the Marvel universe. But this idea of you get your powers in some kind of like freak accident, like you're bit by a radioactive spider. Or Superman was obviously from another planet. But the mutants are kind of born with their powers, and many of them are burdened by them. And so this idea of superheroes as individuals who were suffering became very accessible to the pre-adolescent and then adolescent brain. So this idea of like Wolverine, he's the coolest guy in the world. He can make claws come out of his hands, but he was suffering.
It's an affliction,
because he couldn't remember who he was, and he had been designed to be a weapon. And here's this guy Cyclops, who basically has to wear glasses all the time, or else he'll melt. He'll blast you across the room. And here's this woman Jean Grey, and she can read your thoughts. And boy, wouldn't that be cool? No, it's not cool. Like, I do not want to know what my wife is thinking about me while I'm talking to her. So this idea of like, I love her very much. And I'm going to go on believing that feeling is reciprocated.
So let me build, since you brought Jimmy Olsen into it, it's a really interesting thing to construct a kind of weird lineage from the DC model that you were talking about, and then this movement into Spider-Man and the X-Men. In a way, the most defining of the Marvel characters, because I think that's right. So when the comic books were being invented by these old, sort of grizzled guys who were like magazine professionals in the 30s and 40s, they were guys who didn't already identify with the teenage reader of the product. So they put the teenage surrogate by the side of the character. So you have Billy Batson, who's kind of like with Shazam, and you have Jimmy Olsen, who's kind of gets to run alongside next to Superman, and obviously you have Robin. It's like the grown-up, omnipotent millionaire or alien, and then you have a kind of audience surrogate teenager who's stuck on the side of the comic book. And even the first important Marvel characters, Captain America, has a teenager running alongside him, Bucky. The real transformation that happens then when you get to Spider-Man and the X-Men, along with the sense of them being afflicted, is they are the teenager. The Jimmy Olsen and the Superman have been crushed together into one character who the reader identifies with directly. It's instead of like getting to hang out with Superman, you are Spider-Man, and you're a suffering acne. Spider-Man's affliction isn't only his powers; it's also that he's unpopular in high school, right? And so there's this change into it becoming a thing where the creators were younger and they'd grown up with superheroes themselves, and they began to identify both more with the reader and the fan who could love these characters. They're less at arm's length. They're less like a kind of golden, distant idol or emblem, and they're more like a person that everyone's feeling sorry for but mixed up with.
And I think something else bears mentioning in regards to that, which is they have to start wearing masks. And I think that this idea, obviously Batman in the DC universe wears a mask for an entirely different purpose, right? Which is, at least the stated goal is to strike fear into the hearts of the criminals in Gotham. But in the Marvel universe, this idea of wearing a mask is really to conceal one's own identity for a variety of reasons. One is, I don't want anyone to see the real me, but then there's also this sort of sense of shame or of potentially endangering. That's always like the number one reason, which is, if you knew that who I really was, Green Goblin, you could come after Mary Jane if you knew that Peter Parker was Spider-Man. And meanwhile, Superman's like, I don't give a shit. Like, he'll put glasses on. I mean, that, and we all kind of joke about the Clark Kent of it all. And I always harken back to that amazing speech at the end of Kill Bill Volume 2. In terms of, this is what Superman kind of thinks of humanity. Clark Kent is actually the costume that he wears, and he thinks that we are pathetic and bumbling, and it was this very interesting way that in a way that only Tarantino could. But I do think that this idea of the secret identity is very specific to Judaism. And passing.
But you can also extend it, because Superman and Batman have got secret identities, but they're kind of cursory. And the reason they're cursory, is that their intrinsic identity is Superman and Batman. Clark Kent is a kind of a joke or a pretense, and Bruce Wayne is a callow millionaire who doesn't bother to have any redeeming virtues or any real needs. He's just a playboy, because his real self is Batman. That's where he's fulfilling his true identity. When you get to the later characters, in a way, Peter Parker is the real person, and Spider-Man is something he's trying to be and is afraid. Spider-Man is the pretense. Spider-Man is an attempt at something. And you can almost look at this increased vulnerability of the secret identity, the willingness to be more conflicted and vulnerable, as being like the equivalent of like that now Dustin Hoffman can be the movie star,
right?
Instead of Cary Grant,
right?
We could, it's almost like the Philip Roth moment, when the Jewish establishment is so angry at Philip Roth for embarrassing them, and he's like, come on, let's just, we can be this vulnerable thing now.
Okay, I want to take a couple of steps back and we talked a little bit about the suffering in their lives with their powers, and I think that's really interesting, and I want to hit that. But first, in the origin stories, it seems to me that there's a tremendous amount of trauma for many of them in their childhood, in their past, and this is very much a part of the Jewish story, and I very much believe that someone could survive the Holocaust and very justifiably come out hating humanity and wanting only to care for and protect and sustain his or her own. And someone could survive the Holocaust and come out loving humanity and feeling that life is a gift and wanting to do everything in his or her power to protect and save people, because nobody fought to save my family. And so it seems like there are two legitimate responses to trauma. There are many, but there are two primary responses to trauma, and the character of a person is essentially, what do you choose to do with your suffering? And I wonder if you could reflect a little bit. Many of the women, of the female superheroes and villains, have sexual assault in their past. Many of the male superheroes lost their parents or witnessed some awful trauma firsthand. Can you talk about that decision point between what makes somebody a hero and what makes somebody a villain, and the role that the traumatic experience of their past might play in that?
Yeah, I mean, I think managing trauma is embedded in the most compelling stories over and over and over again. And I mean, the figure I'm endlessly fascinated by is Jack Kirby. He's the guy who created the majority of the Marvel characters. In that, somebody else may have had the claim of having named them or written their dialogue, but in the sense that we receive them in their innate quality, he drew them and characterized them and built their realities. And Kirby was a World War II, a Jewish guy who went to the front in Germany, and I mean, he killed Nazis with his bare hands, and he liberated a camp. And when he came back, he creates these characters who are again and again, beginning with the Fantastic Four, they become tribes of outcasts who have to simultaneously manage their responsibility to protect others and the sense of persecution. And he keeps upping the ante. The first group he creates, the Fantastic Four, are relatively legitimated. Like they have a building in Manhattan, and their most responsible member seems to have a healthy relationship with the authorities and so forth. But then it's as though that doesn't satisfy him. He needs to create a band that's more hunted and more conflicted, and so the X-Men are the next group, and they kind of can't manage their relationship to humanity, and they're persecuted, but they also have the responsibility of protecting everyone. And then he ups the ante with another group called the Inhumans, who are even more monstrous and more responsible. And the ultimate character in the Inhumans is a guy named Black Bolt, who literally can't say a word aloud because his voice will destroy everything. And he's the leader of this group and has to manage knowing too much, having a thing that can't be pronounced.
I think that there's a couple ways of looking at it. I think that if you're looking at this age when in the 1960s, when these characters are starting to flourish, obviously we can talk ad nauseum about what started to happen in the 80s, and I think what started to happen in the 80s and is much more reflective of what's happening in the superhero movies today, which is you try to take a more realistic view of, we all know what happened with the Batman movies in the 80s. It started with Tim Burton's films and ended with George Clooney and nipples on the bat suit, and ultimately what happened was the character became completely and totally unrelatable, and then Christopher Nolan came and said, along with David Goyer, let's just start to talk about this character as if he existed in the real world, in a world relatable to ours, even though understanding that there's no Gotham City. And one of the things that I think that they that was fairly ingenious about that is that in order for it to make sense, Bruce Wayne has to be a little crazy, because only an insane person would come up with this plan. This idea of people's, unfortunately, we live in a violent world, where people's parents are being killed all the time, either in front of them, or it's just something that happens. And there's only one of them says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to dress up like a gigantic bat, and I'm not going to have a gun or anything like that, and I'm going to fight these people. And so I think this idea of it being a reflection of post-traumatic stress, or anger, sort of manifesting in, I'm going to do this and I'm going to beat people up. And obviously Alan Moore looked at this very specifically with The Watchmen, sort of the defining book of that was the moment where I was like, comic books are literature. And then at the same time, Frank Miller was doing a revisionist take on Batman and looking at him as more of somebody who was crazy, because only a crazy person would do this. But I hearken back to the original Spider-Man, which I think, through the prism of the Tobey Maguire movie, Got This Right, which was Spider-Man's origin. We all know that he was bitten by a radioactive spider, and that's how he got his abilities, but it never occurred to him to fight crime. His first instinct was, I'm going to use this ability to make money. I'm going to monetize this skill, and I'm going to wrestle. And only as a result of a fracas that he makes a decision. He sees that a thief is basically making off with like some money after one of these wrestling matches where he's beaten this poor normal person in a submission, and he decides not to stop that thief. He's like, why would I stop this guy? I'm not going to stick my neck out for this guy. And that thief ends up shooting his Uncle Ben, who has basically sort of gifted him with this proverb, like, with great power comes great responsibility. So Spider-Man's origin story is guilt. It literally is guilt. He is only superheroing because he feels guilty. There's no greater call. There's no sense of, I'm going to be a hero and this is the right thing to do. It's literally born out of guilt. And many of the X-Men, they could go two ways. I think it was interesting what you were saying, and for those of us who saw the first X-Men movie, which Bryan Singer directed, this allusion to the fact that there's a character named Magneto who was a child in a concentration camp, and that story was sort of dramatized. And he becomes one of the most evil mutants. When we were growing up, there were the X-Men and the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. You basically choose a side, and the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, they have they actually. There was something to what they were saying, which is essentially like, you can be good guys and you can fight for these assholes who want to kill you, or you can join us and essentially we can eradicate Homo sapiens, and because this is the age of Homo superior, and they were essentially becoming the very thing that they reviled. So this whole kind of Stanford prison experiment thing was happening, but you were getting into much headier, more textured stuff that I think it has really kind of given birth to. There's roughage now in our diet when it comes to these stories.
I'm so interested in the way that in what's happening in the culture is what ultimately produces our fantasies. So as we were saying earlier, it seems like it makes so much sense that in an age of complete disempowerment, or in an age of where there's a very clear good versus evil, that Superman would emerge. And now, as I have learned, through looking at this material, there's much greater moral ambiguity in the comic books. It's darker, they're more complex. The characters are not, the heroes are not, they're not always behaving the way you would imagine a hero would behave. So what is it about living in America in the 21st century that you think we're seeing on this, that is being reflected back to us on the screen?
Do you want to?
Well, it's a huge question, but I mean, I think if you look at certain trajectories, I mean, I think you were mentioning that the way the Christopher Nolan Batman movies darkened that story and dealt with it as one of abreaction to trauma, that Batman's kind of crazy, but you can also look at him very much as a political conversation, that essentially how we think about Batman is how we think about vigilantism and secret power. And in the 60s, when the public sentiment was that in the Vietnam era that we were being humiliated, and that the Pentagon Papers needed to be exposed, Batman could only be this camp figure. No one wanted a powerful, credible, vigilante surrogate. And then, post 9/11, the emblem that Frank Miller had explored suddenly became incredibly appealing to the kind of unconscious desire for, a really viable, even if it was upsetting and turbulent, and he was going to do things in our name that we weren't going to be comfortable with, and we were going to have to agonize about that. He became enormously competent and dangerous and impressive, and that trilogy of movies is so upsetting because it's a very, very conflicted celebration of vigilante power in a democratic world.
And I think elaborating on that, and you mentioned this, Sharon, is the idea, the American idea. This idea of superheroes is is uniquely American in terms of sort of its identity and sort of the idea of like if we just close our eyes and think about these movies or these comic books and say like, okay, so who's your favorite French superhero? like there's like Captain Britain, but like what about a South American superhero? Or there was I remember
Salvate,
yeah,
was it?
but there was just a group of lame ass superheroes called Alpha Flight when we were growing up, and they were Canadian. You know, it was just like one. You know, the Guardian. He had like a maple leaf like right here. It was like I don't care what this guy can do. He's fucking Canadian. You know, like and I say this only in jest because there is this idea of like fundamental superiority built into the American identity, where it's sort of like, well, even if I'm a Jew, at least I'm an American Jew, and that still makes me. You know, that gives me a superiority over sort of the rest of the world. And I'm just throwing out, like, for those of you who are interested at all in doing the deep dive in any of these comic books, there's a great comic book called Red Sun it's Mark Miller, and essentially the idea, it's a what-if story. What if Superman crashed in Russia instead of Kansas?
Yeah.
And it's amazing. And it just makes you realize this whole idea of Superman stands for truth, justice, and the American way, as if the American way was a value system that he got on Krypton. But no, he got it from the Kents. And so if he basically crash lands in the Ukraine in 1937, there is no America. Like, because Superman becomes weaponized and militarized by the communists, and it's done in this very fascinating kind of alt history way. But like, I do think that idea of the nationalism has become, it's no longer cool. And one of the things that I was wondering when they first announced the Marvel movies was like, okay, Tony Stark, we can relate to the guy, to a drunk tech industrialist who's kind of like, kind of messes up and out for his own, and then he has a change of heart, he gets injured, he turns into Iron Man. But how is Captain America, how is that idea going to translate and sort of like, how is that cool to kids? And what's interesting about it is, the first movie was hung a little bit on what I would argue is patriotism, but they had to set it in World War II in order for us, and that's the last time that we can really tap into an idea of hey, we were the good guys. Like, Captain America in World War II makes sense, but he's not talking about America in the Avengers. Like, he's wearing the red, white, and blue, but, they call him Cap. Like, they're just like, just forget about the America part, which I think is very interesting and distancing.
I want to ask you about God.
I thought that's what we've been talking about.
So it's very interesting to me how skeptical and ambivalent and cynical many Jews are. The more time I spend in black churches, and I have a number of friends who are pastors now, and I get invited to church, and I'm so moved by the pure expression of faith in those spaces, and the deep and very personal love that so many people have and express toward God. And then in the Jewish space, where it's a much more kind of intellectualized engagement, it's about shared history, it's about ritual, and there are people who have faith and they tend to keep quiet about it, and there are people who don't have faith and they tend to be a little bit louder about it. But basically, God is not an essential to the conversation. And so the whole question of a kind of supernatural is, I mean, you could live a very full Jewish life and not have to really come to terms with the presence of God in your life or in the world. So here's why I think this is interesting for in the context of this conversation. So I've heard that there are a couple of upcoming superhero films that are kind of like superhero civil wars between Superman and Batman. And I know as soon as my son started getting into superheroes when he was like 4, immediately we went to it's Hulk versus Spider-Man, who wins, and like this sort of need to put two good guys against each other, like who's stronger. And I was wondering, like, but why do I know why 4-year-old boys need that? But why do But why do grown-ups need that? And so here's my theory, and just tell me what you think about this, given my little backdrop about the Jewish community and the tremendous ambivalence about faith, is that what might be going on here is a kind of debate between Batman, tell me if I'm wrong, is about like sort of stretching the limits of it's a very human capacity for action in the world. So whatever he can think up, whatever gadgets he can create, that's what he's invested in, and that's what he'll use in the world. Whereas Superman's really supernatural. He comes from another place. He's got these powers that can't be replicated or duplicated by other people, even if they're very, very smart and very resourced. So is this actually an attempt to discern, does real power come from up there, or does real power come from in here? Is that part of what might be going on in the grown-up version of battling human versus supernatural, but just calling them both superhero?
Well, I don't know anything about the Superman versus Batman movie.
I know more about something.
No, I mean,
That's astounding.
I've seen the trailer, and I try not to get spoiled for this, and I know what the comic book precedent is, for this matchup, because Superman and Batman have squared off, and Superman has races with the Flash, and they're usually good-natured. But I think that what you're talking about on kind of a meta level is that Superman is God, I mean, in the context of the way that movie, the language, if you just watch the trailer for Superman versus Batman, they're using deified language for Superman now, where and the way that he's presented, hovering, there's a woman on her rooftop in some sort of flooded out area, and he's backlit and sort of floating above her, and she's all but sort of kind of bowing before him. And I think Batman is even kind of using language like this guy thinks he's a god, or he's being treated like a god. And there's acolytes and religions that are basically starting to kind of form around this idea of what would happen if Superman really existed. And so Batman's goal seems to be nothing less than deicide, in terms of, it's not just about saying I'm going to take this guy down a peg, but it is the mythic story. It's Joseph Campbell. It's Luke and Darth. It is that it is that idea of I kind of have to kill my father, or I have to kill God, because God can be vengeful, and I think that that's really what it all boils down to in terms of this disconnect between the black church experience, perhaps, and my own experience with conservative Judaism, which was, the God that I became familiar with, through my Judaic tradition, was one to be feared. And I think that what's really interesting about Superman is, we all saw the Superman the movie, Will You Believe a Man Can Fly? And there's nothing scary about Christopher Reeve. He's dreamy. He's not presented as scary at all. He's there to help. By the time you get to Superman 3, let's not even get started on that, but he's smoking cigarettes at a bar. And in any case, he is. That's not a joke. But this idea that's being advanced in the new Superman film is but Superman's dangerous, and if he decides that he wants to kill us all or enslave us all, or bring or get rid of our nuclear weapons just because he wants to, that's a very, very frightening idea. And Batman is there to basically give us our humanity back, because I do think that this idea of hey, look, it's God in 1979 was this is fun, and now in 2015 it's let's kill him, because I would take a straw poll amongst kids, and I would venture to guess that if you said Superman versus Batman, who do you want to win? Not who wins. Who do you want to win? Who are you rooting for? Mm-hmm. And I venture to guess most of them are rooting for Batman.
Can we just ask in here? Superman? Who's rooting for Superman? Who's rooting for Batman?
Yeah. So I would extend this just a little further, connected to some of what you were saying earlier too. I mean, even from the very beginning, I think the God problem was embedded in the Superman image. And it was true from a storyteller's perspective, the problem of what do you do with a guy who can do anything? And this connects in a way to those Jimmy Olsen comics where he only shows up at the end. He has to be managed narratively because he's so omnipotent. And, it raises two problems. It raises the problem of what stories can you tell in that situation, and why does he care about us? Or even does he care about us? And, and that's really the only kind of storytelling you can do around Superman when you get serious about him. I mean, that's what Watchmen ends up being, is a consideration of that quasi-Superman character at the center of it, who can save or destroy worlds, and so why does he care about us, and what are his purposes? And, in fact, there's a long history of these rooting against Superman stories. When we were kids, they pitted him against Spider-Man in the first cross-pollination, and these elaborate mechanics were set up to make it a fair fight, to give Spider-Man a chance against Superman. There was like a way in which Spider-Man was put into an arena where it was fair. And he also fought Muhammad Ali. I don't know if you remember that.
I do. It was a supersized comic book.
Yeah. So it is, I think, this eternal problem of the God figure and what he does to stories, but what he also does to the scale of human reality. And for me, one of the most compelling versions of the paradox of faith is that if God really is all he's cracked up to be, then to make the world possible, he has to withdraw. He has to, the world as we know it is essentially the space vacated by his absenting himself from the area. And Superman has to do that for narrative. He has to be broken down in some way by kryptonite, by some other narrative trick, which sometimes turns out to be a dream or a fantasy or a kind of or he has to be opposed in some credible way by the human force in order for there to be anything. It's almost like a creation myth itself. Go away, Superman, so that we can breathe,
Right, and yet who doesn't fantasize about having Superman sweep in and grab the plane before it lands in the Sinai? I mean, I think this is what's so very human about this, and the sort of psycho-spiritual. I wanted to just talk a little bit more about power and powerlessness, and in a couple minutes we're going to take questions from everybody. First, I'm going to do a little rapid fire with both of you before we get there.
Because we talk a lot, don't we?
We're New York Jews. New Jersey Jews, some of us. So
Proud of it.
I just put myself in the New York category as opposed to his New Jersey. Okay.
Yes.
So I want to, I'm sure as you noted in my Rosh Hashanah sermon from this year, Damon, one of the things that I really have been wrestling with.
I didn't really start to understand until the third time I listened to it.
That's a problem. All right. Yeah. So one of the things that I've been really wrestling with the past several years is this power and powerlessness, is this sort of paradox of power. On one hand, we have the capacity to do absolutely extraordinary, previously unimaginable things in the world, and yet it seems like we cannot solve the most basic human needs. We can't figure out how to address the most basic concerns about safety, about community, about health, and about equality of opportunity. So I'm very interested in what it means. What is the kind of tension that emerges around power and powerlessness here? On one hand, and again, I'm sort of drawn back to, I actually think about this poem from Bialik. It's the image of a Cossack attacking raping a Jewish woman while the husband's under the bed, trembling, and then going to the rabbi afterwards saying, "Rabbi, can I still have sex with my wife now that she's been attacked?" This is like the epitome of powerlessness. And in response to that emerges the image of the Sabra. This is a Jew who can be totally self-possessed, can have power, can protect himself and his family, herself. And so on one hand, there's kind of the fantasy of having that kind of power is an admission of our own weakness. At the same time, identifying with a hero is sort of when we identify with the hero, we're tapping into our own strength. When we fantasize about the hero, we're tapping into our own weakness. I'm really interested in hearing what your thoughts are about some of these characters who you guys grew up, knowing intimately and loving. I mean, are they and are we in our relationship with them ultimately more powerful, or were we ultimately admitting to our own sort of failure as human beings to own the power that we might have, and instead turning it over to these other fantastic creatures that they might be able to do the job for us?
Yeah. Well, do you want?
Yeah. Again, I think that it's a shifting scale. I mean, ultimately, on the level down here that you're talking about, which is a highly intellectualized level and is an emotional level, and so we're processing these things on an emotional level. There's also just way up here a fundamental idea of escapism in story. Mm-hmm. And I think that we all sort of, there's something kind of amazing about the first Star Wars film in terms of just how simple and clean it is. And obviously as time goes on, it gets more dark and more nuanced. And this exploration of temptation and the dark side being more powerful, I think is this idea. But ultimately, really what it comes down to is that the power of these stories are, the draw isn't just superhuman abilities or superpowers or origin stories or our ability to relate to these people. These are good versus evil stories, and the line is very clean. And we are living in a world where the line is more and more confusing, and that idea of, I do a lot of work with recidivism, and so this idea of growing up and imagining that everyone who is incarcerated is bad. This is kind of just the way that we think. If you're in prison, and if you went to prison for armed robbery and you aren't disputing your innocence or guilt, you walked up to somebody with a gun and asked them for money, and you're bad. And that's just not true. Like, we're learning this now. Like, this idea that every person is capable of what we would call evil, that we all feel that, that there is moral ambiguity in terms of what you would do to protect your family. Like, I am anti-death penalty until some horrific fate has befallen someone that I love, and then I'm like, lethal injection all the way. So this idea of, like, we're constantly struggling with this idea of what is good and what is evil, and these characters don't. At least the fundamental sort of draw of them is like, Wolverine may be nuanced, but he's a good guy. Mm-hmm. He always does the right thing. And there's this sort of like Batman and Superman both have the same code, which is they do not kill. Like, that's kind of where they draw the line. And so in this recent Superman film, Man of Steel, that came out a couple years ago, the big thing in the zeitgeist, right, was that Superman killed General Zod. Like, this other Kryptonian who basically came down and said, Superman, I am going to kill everyone on Earth who will not worship me, and I will not stop. I cannot be stopped. Nothing's going to stop me. There's no prison you can put me in. And so Superman's only recourse is to basically kill the guy. And we, as either a fan community or, more importantly, it's this other thing that I'm talking about, which is, but that's bad. We don't want Superman to kill people because killing's bad under any circumstances. Like, there had to be a different way for you to deal with General Zod. Like, and I think that it is ultimately this idea of, there is no storytelling that is more focused on this idea of, of good versus evil than the superhero mythos.
Yeah, I'm listening, and I think it's really right, but I think I would also say it seems to helplessly turn into a trap door for problems of complicity. In a way, it took a very long time for Superman to kill. He was a very sacred emblem of the simplicity of the story. But it only took a couple of films for Luke to be tempted by the dark side, and that, in a sense, it's sort of like you're always starting with this incredibly compelling and reassuring clarity, and it always enmeshes you in the need to identify with culpability or compromise or enmeshment in the world. So it's like there's this constant rehearsal of the failure of those simplicities, right? Because the stories always seem to also be going in this direction, you know. And I mean, I think a lot about the emblem of the superhero as the image of the creative individual. And you know, when I picked it up to use it in the Fortress of Solitude, I was throwing it into juxtaposition with these people who were in various kind of impure, expressive relationships to culture. The graffiti artist, who's both famous and a secret. You know, the thing about desiring and identifying to be Superman is the first thing you think is, oh, it's great, I'll be the most famous person on earth, and for good things. Everyone will know me and celebrate me. But the very next thing the superhero does is become tormented adolescent who hides. And even Superman has this, you know, why does Superman need the Fortress of Solitude? This is the strangest thing, that someone so ostensibly healthy and positive should want to go and walk around and talk to statues of his friends instead of being with them. But even Superman contains this doubleness where the famous and celebrated and justifiable, perfect being has another model of furtiveness, guilt, diffidence, you know, evasion, secrecy. And so it's very strange how one always is giving way to the other.
And it's lonely. And it's interesting that you were just saying that, because I've never really thought before about the urge, you know, like if I was Banksy, I'd be like, boy, that Banksy's pretty great, huh? Like, he's pretty cool, huh? Like, the urge to just let people know you're Banksy has got to be so overwhelming. But the idea of knowing the curse that's on the other side of it, because I talk about the original the Christopher Reeve Superman movie because we just showed it to my son a couple weeks ago. But this amazing thing happens, which is, you know, Clark and Superman are obviously the same guy, and they both are interested in Lois Lane, you know, and so Superman grants Lois Lane this interview that turns into like he like really wants to sweep her off her feet, quite literally, and he takes her for a flight around New York and they Metropolis, and they go by the Statue of Liberty, which is apparently also Metropolis, and then he drops her off, and it's very chaste, like but he knows like she's just putty in his hands because he's Superman, and then like a second later there's a knock on the door and it's Clark, you know, and he's like, hey Lois, I'm here for our date, and she's completely unimpressed by him. She's like, oh, okay, you know, I'll be ready in a second, Clark, and she goes into the other room to like grab her purse, and while he's standing there alone, he takes off his glasses, Clark does, and he says in his Superman voice, Lois, there's something I need to tell you. And I was like, on his first date, he needs her to know, like, I'm Superman, because he's worried that he might not get laid as Clark. I don't know, but the urge and the temptation to, you know, to reveal one's true self is so overwhelming. And I again, I don't know how this relates to any of the things that we're talking about, but
it's all Torah.
It's gotta, you know,
it's all Torah, because
it's gotta
here's the
relate
thing.
to, yeah.
So after Moses goes up up to the top of the mountain, and has this, you know, this very intense, intimate experience with God. So when Moses comes down, he has to put a mask on also, and because people can't bear to see him as radiant as he is now. And so he lifts the mask when he has to, and then he puts the mask back down immediately. And lifts the mask when he encounters God in the tent, and then puts it back down, because he needs something there has to be something in between him and the people because he's too powerful. And there's also, so the experience of connectedness with something greater than him also prevents him from fully connecting with the people, with the very people he's called to serve. Okay, I know you have a lot of questions, so I'm going to do a quick rapid fire. Jeb Bush. What should he have said when he was asked on multiple occasions, who's your favorite superhero? Because I think we can all agree that the way he answered it.
What did he say? I don't
he
know.
said, Supergirl, she's kind of hot.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
right. So what should he have said? But it's a tricky question because a lot of these superheroes end up fighting for immigrants and for, and for the vulnerable. So what would have been a better answer for him?
Channeling Jeb Bush. How does one go about that?
It's rapid fire. So
Batman. He should have just said
Batman.
Batman.
Okay.
Everybody loves Batman.
Okay. Ready for number 2?
Yeah.
Israel. So, which superhero do we need right now to make peace between Israelis and Palestinians and solve the crisis of the broader region?
No. You gotta feel this
that's
one.
really crazy. I think actually that maybe that ought to be Black Bolt, silent presiding.
Yes.
Right.
Of the Inhumans. He who speaks but one word.
3 people here understood what you just said. So
Just
for the rest of us,
I was describing him earlier. He's the leader of the Inhumans, whose voice is so powerful that he just has to shut up.
okay.
Only shut up.
Do you have an evil villain list today, and who's at the top of it?
In terms of in the real world,
Yeah.
or just in the
Yeah,
world
the real
of,
world.
of comic books?
Yeah.
Oh my God. Assad's got to be way up there right now. Putin is like, it's kind of amazing, that guy, in terms of if there was a Bond film and the introduction to the Bond villain was that he came riding up on a horse, shirtless,
no shirt on,
and
yeah.
ripped, I would be like, come on. And like, that's Putin. So
Yeah, he's
awesome.
He's sort of Victor Von Doom in a
Yes.
certain way.
That's right. Yeah, he's a good one.
Okay.
He's the despot who runs Latveria, which is, I think it's like it's Marvel Comics sort of stand-in for like Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
Latveria, bad.
Latveria.
Yeah.
Okay, my 4th and final question, then we're happy to take your questions. So I think somebody has collected some cards. Ikar, will you come to Ikar? Because we like you. You already have a built-in community friend. I want to thank you both so much. We really appreciate your time and your wisdom and insight, and we would love to hear the questions from the crowd. What is on your mind?
Ooh.
Me, okay. Yes. Okay. What about 007? Is he a Superman?
We were just talking about this. No, I don't think so. I think that the spy genre is an entirely different animal.
Yeah, I think it's true that the genre motifs are really different. Even when the spy is sort of elevated to the level of, he's made into a quasi superhero because he's so unassailable. He's not a John le Carré reflective, vulnerable spy, but it means different things. And
I also think if you guys aren't following this, though, there's this rather fascinating and unique thing happening in popular culture right now, which is Spectre is coming out, which is the new James Bond film. It's going to make, we're all going to go see it. It's going to make a lot of money. And Daniel Craig, who's been playing Bond, like one of the sort of unwritten rules in our business is if you take the money, you shut up. And he will tell anybody who asks him on his press tour how disgusted he is with the character of James Bond. And he's not joking. He says, like, people are asking him, would you want to do this again? And he says like, I'd rather be cut with razor blades. And and they say like, it's pretty cool that he, they're talking about his female co-stars and Monica Bellucci, and he'll say it's nice to finally be playing against someone Bond's age, because it's kind of creepy for an actor of my age to be. And so you can see the interviewers getting very uncomfortable with sort of like the idea that he's kind of poking holes in this mythology, because we're supposed to like James Bond. And I think that it's the same thing with that Will Smith movie that's coming out about concussions, which is, I want to enjoy football. And I know that if I'm going to go and see that Will Smith movie, I'm going to enjoy football less, because I know that these men are being seriously injured. And I would rather just not think about it. And so I do feel like in that space of, of myth, James Bond lives, but probably in a slightly different genre than the
Yeah, well, I mean,
superheroes.
what's interesting is they've even put quasi James Bond like figures into the kind of the worlds of superheroes. I mean, that's who the Shield
Right.
character is. That sort of comes from that other range of signifiers, right? And they sit there oddly because they don't know what to do if they don't have superpowers
Right.
in that world.
And they're allowed to kill wantonly.
A little follow-up to that, and if this is a dumb question, I'll pretend it was on one of these cards. But is Harry Potter kind of a superhero?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, well, he functions by the same rules as the typical mythic hero, where he has a lineage that has been hidden from him.
Mm-hmm.
He's an orphan, and he has another part of the superhero mythos that is certainly more in vogue today, is the idea of destiny, or some sort of, and this is much more biblical, is the idea of like prophecy, where it's like Harry Potter is the boy who lived, and his destiny is to basically, he killed Voldemort, but if Voldemort should ever rise again, and Harry Potter in the first book, he's I don't think a 10 or 11-year-old kid, or he's about to turn 11, and when he walks around on the street, people will sometimes recognize him and be like, "Oh my God, Harry Potter, you're amazing!" And he's like,
He doesn't know why
I don't
yet,
know
yeah.
why that is."
Yeah, but also, I mean, this brings in something we haven't talked about. 'Cause we focus so much on the specific American, kind of pulp lineage, but there is a way in which so much of what we're talking about does give way to some really important traceable connection to fairy tale, to other archetypes like that you find in the Man in the Iron Mask or the Prince and the Pauper, of the which also exists in pulp American science fiction, the race of Supermen lurking around ignominiously, waiting to erupt into power, the Slan or whatever.
I'll say something else about Harry Potter, which I think bears mentioning here, which is there's something very exclusionary about the magicking universe, which is if you are non-magical, you are not allowed to go to Hogwarts. So so that idea of you have to be born magical, it's not something that you can learn. And it's possible for you to have two parents who are non-magical, but they are not allowed to come and visit you at Hogwarts.
Well, it really is the X-Men. It works exactly the same way.
So there is this idea of being chosen,
Right.
of having these innate abilities, but the
but
price.
with no intro to Judaism class.
Correct.
There's
yes.
no conversion path, right?
But there's a price, and it's a blessing and a curse too. And I think that idea of oh my God, I'm magic.
Right.
Right on the heels of that is, and people are going to be trying to kill you constantly.
Yes.
So I was given these messages in equal portions at Passover, which is you are chosen, and because you are chosen, people will be trying to kill you constantly.
Right. Right.
And you can't have it. You have to have it both ways.
You're also in this world where you look like everybody else, but you're different. And when it comes down to it, people can determine whether you're the same or different. Okay, I want to talk about women for a minute. A couple people asked about this, and I had a couple of thoughts I wanted to ask you to clarify. So I mean, I think that there's a lot of misogyny in the comic books and in some of these films, and it's not only the way that they dress the women, but a lot of the passivity and sort of helplessness of the women. And then there's Wonder Woman, who's really awesome. And so, can you just break down for a moment, the role of women in this genre? What's going on here? And what are you doing about it?
Well, first off, I think that there is a perception, and I don't have the metrics to back it up, but it is the domineering perception, and it survives to this day, which is that the people who are most interested in these characters, the people who will shell out money to buy comic books, who will shell out money to see movies, who will shell out money to buy action figures, are males. And so that perception exists. Again, I don't have the data, but I see just as many women here tonight as men, and given the what the subject matter is, I firmly believe that women are just as interested in these kinds of stories as men are, but the market may not reflect that. And as a result of this bias, that I think a lot of the things that you're talking about have sort of fundamentally gone in the wrong direction. Wonder Woman, who is kind of like, for lack of a better way of describing her, the token female superhero. Very few people in this room could probably tell me what her origin story is. Where she's from, how she got her abilities, what her power set is. We all saw probably the Wonder Woman TV show with the Invisible Jet and that sort of thing. But her, even her story, I think, is not as mythic or as well known. And for a business that basically prides itself on familiarity, my wife knows Bruce Wayne's origin story, but has no interest in, in the superhero mythos. It just hasn't pervaded in that way. I do think that things are starting to change. Obviously, Supergirl just debuted last week. It did huge ratings. People were interested in it because it had a built-in audience, and I do think that there does seem to be a consciousness in the writing towards this idea of misogyny, and talking about it and leaning into it and reclaiming it. There's a show on Netflix starting in a couple weeks called Jessica Jones, based on an amazing, very kind of fringe Marvel character.
That's
a
wonderful book.
It's amazing, based on a book called Alias by this guy, Brian Bendis, and it really talks about all these things. And so I guess the answer to your first question is, like, don't pretend it's not there. If you pretend it's not there and you just try to be PC and say this is amazing, because Wonder Woman sort of living in this world is going to fall victim to those ideas, and is going to be presented in, already, if you just basically look at the posters for Batman versus Superman, Wonder Woman is showing more skin. Like, she's got a sword and she's a badass and she is just as strong as the guys. But I do think that there are coded, messages that are being marketed to a predominantly male audience.
That's pretty complete. I mean, it's obviously a place where the deficiencies in our culture are reflected in the most dire possible ways, right? What's so interesting about Wonder Woman, I mean, in fact, where she does, I just thinking about this because I was listening to Gloria Steinem talk on the radio this morning, and she made this remark that really was like so arresting because it was so simple. She said, feminism is memory. It's a recollection of a pre-misogynist cultural reality. And in fact, to create Wonder Woman, her origin story is of the Amazons. They had to go, and what's so fascinating about her is that she doesn't get it. She isn't fighting against misogyny. She's just from a time when that was beyond consideration. It's like, obviously, I come from a female warrior race. Get over it. I'm around.
Not to mention, though, a female warrior race that was completely and totally sealed off from men. So men did not exist in the culture in which Diana was raised, and so and in those early Wonder Woman comic books and any retelling of her origin story, so there's Themyscira, which is the island where the Amazons live, and then everything outside of that is referred to as the world of man. And her mother Artemis, and so we're dealing with Greek mythology. Essentially says to her, because she's having the same kind of wanderlust as Luke Skywalker does. I feel like the call of the greater world. I want to explore is this idea of, like, do not go into the world of man. because and obviously I think that the messaging is obvious, which is, and when she does, she's offered a secretary job, which she takes.
Which it did. So just for one moment, it reminds me what Gloria Steinem said, and thank you for bringing it. Is very much like the story of Lilith in our tradition, which is, it's so interesting. But these male rabbis take the inconsistencies between two creation stories in the beginning of Genesis, and essentially say that's because there were two different creation stories. At first, there was man and woman created equal to one another. That was Lilith, and Lilith insisted on equality with Adam, which is why she was sent away. And then Eve was created, who had no problem being submissive to Adam. And so it's interesting. Like, we're all descendants of Eve, but they put this creature Lilith out into the Jewish consciousness, and then turn her into a she demon. Right? So first they invent a radical equality and the desire for it as the most core human instinct, the first woman, and then turn that into something evil. And so I think there's a constant wrestling with that intention, with that in our tradition. A couple more questions, since we only have a few more minutes. So for you, Jonathan, can you talk about writing Omega the Unknown? How is writing comics different from writing novels? Any plans to write more comics?
Okay, well, yeah. Thanks for such a specific question. The truth is, I hated writing Omega the Unknown as a writing act, and I probably will never write another comic as a result of it. And I don't mean I was unhappy with the result. I was beside myself to be asked in the first place by Marvel, and to then get to collaborate with the artists I worked with, Farrell Dalrymple and Gary Panter and Paul Hornschenmeyer. It was like a kind of dream come true. And I had this really energized experience of relating myself to the materials of these comic books directly that I'd usually just handled indirectly. But the actual way I was spending my days, trying to write instructions for drawing panels and then just limiting my language to what the characters would say in the word balloons, drove me crazy. Compared to what I normally do, which is write, full, a novelist is a very imperial artist compared to almost anyone in an industry like Damon's or like the comic book industry. I mean, I'm the set dresser. I make everything out of language, and I like that totality, and I like that my words are the work itself. It's like it's a clay, and I make what I want to make, and to be working in this way that was more like creating blueprints for something somebody else was going to execute it was maddening. I just felt really, the usual pleasure I take from the writing act wasn't there. And so I just fought my way through that feeling and created this thing that the result I'm very happy with. But unless a really magical set of occasions came together, like just another impossible to refuse combination of character and collaborators, which is what that was with Omega the Unknown, I doubt I would be in that situation again. I'm more satisfied by writing the prose fiction.
Right. I'm very interested in this question. Can you speak to comic books as outsider art and how that's changed? And I wonder, for people like you who really, I feel this way about the rabbis. I start to know them so intimately. The rabbis from 2,000 years ago, and you see that you can sort of trace their the trends in the ways that they speak and the relationships they build and the ways that they are self-defeating, and you're rooting for them and you love them. And then so what would it mean to have those relationships on the big screen and have millions and millions of people? Like, this is your own little private story. It is outsider art, and yet it's totally mainstream. It's mainstreaming now. How does that feel for you? Do you feel like something is lost when the whole world gets to see your little secret?
Make it sound so filthy. No, I think part of any cultural movement that brands itself as counterculture. So there's an aspect of human nature where you basically discover a thing and it's niche cool. And so I remember, like, when I was in like 6th or 7th grade, and my friends and I started listening to the Smiths. And it was like we were the kids who listened to the Smiths, and like nobody else knew who the Smiths were, and that's what made the Smiths cool. And then then suddenly everybody was listening to the Smiths, and it doesn't stop you from liking the Smiths, but you know the cred factor goes down, and I think that we've seen the shift. I went to Comic-Con, which has been held in San Diego since I moved out to Los Angeles in 1994. I went to my first Comic-Con in 1995, and it didn't really start tipping until like the early 2000s, like into this thing that we now know as this kind of mecca of pop culture, and it's become more of a marketing expo. We all still go, but it's transformed into this other thing. And I do think it's interesting that you use the word art, and that we talk about comic books as art, because I do feel like, you know, if you talk about a novel, there's an aspect of credibility, even if it is the shittiest novel ever written has more credibility than the most wonderful comic book ever written, you know, or even putting the word graphic novel in front of something, you know, like inside our culture, certainly in Los Angeles, those things have credibility now, but the word comic in and of itself can't be taken seriously, because it's the word comic and because of its provenance. So, you know, my son just read a graphic novel that blew his mind. It's called El Defo, and it's the writer's name is CC something. It's amazing, and he was like, this is one of the greatest things that I've ever read, and you know. And my wife opened it up and was like, oh, it's a comic book. And like, she didn't say it in a derogatory way at all. And I was like, it's a graphic novel. Like, because I do feel like there's this sort of like, it's story, right? And it's very intricate story and very beautiful. Anybody who's ever read Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which is sort of one of the definitive, you know, stories, retellings of the Jewish experience, is amazing. It just so happens to be told in graphic novel format. I do hope that that 20, 30 years from now, like that a graphic novel could receive the same amount of cred as a legit novel. And I think when someone like you crosses into, you know, it does legitimize, because it almost never happens. Michael Chabon, of course, has done it as well, but I do think it's sort of like, oh my, these guys are serious writers writing comic books. What could that possibly mean? It means that the comic books deserve, you know, legitimate attention.
Yeah, and of course the irony is that this pompous credibility is mostly really kind of a hoary and it's an imaginary thing, because the novel was a street form itself. When the novel emerged, it was regarded with disdain as being kind of for bored housewives. Serious writers wrote lyric poetry or essays. The novel is not in some, you know, it doesn't have some innate kind of highbrow authority. The forms don't inherently contain that kind of authority. They're just ways of telling stories. But I mean, I'm guilty to some extent of still indulging. I have a perverse resistance to the total success of the superhero image, because it seems to me it does lose something usually from the kinds of peculiar, you know, in some ways outsider or just mannerist intensity that you find in the kind of comic books that I loved most when I was young. By the time it's been made ready for a gigantic audience, I don't usually sense the same energy in it.
And I'll just say this, in the glass half full way of looking at this, I do feel like the canvas is so big, the screen is so big, the audience is so hungry now for this kind of storytelling that you can Trojan horse or embed kind of more radical thinking into these, you know, into these pop culture. So Ta-Nehisi Coates is writing a Black Panther movie for Marvel, and, or it's a comic book, and they have optioned it, and et cetera, and you essentially go like, wow, that's that's going to potentially be a special story. It's not going to reach the same audience that Guardians of the Galaxy is going to reach, but the Marvel branding has now basically proven that they can, how many people are going to read Ta-Nehisi Coates' writing? You have that number over here. Now he's writing in a Black Panther comic book. That number has to increase tenfold.
So, okay, so just to close, I want to, there's something called the Heroic Imagination Project that I just wanted to bring because you talked earlier about the Stanford Prison experiment, and I thought it would be an interesting way for us to close because it kind of ties together a lot of the themes we've been talking about. But I don't know if any of you have heard about a new nonprofit organization that essentially it was created by Philip Zimbardo, who's the same person who did the Stanford Prison experiments. And what he said was that after many years of studying why people don't step forward to act heroically, why we would more likely be bystanders and let something awful happen in front of us, particularly the more people there are watching, the less likely we are to engage. Instead, he wanted to try to figure out what it would take to actually cultivate a hero instinct, and it's really interesting.
He wrote a book called The Lucifer Effect. Have you?
No.
Zimbardo.
No.
It's the opposite of what you're talking about.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think he spent most of his career doing the opposite, and now he's trying to.
Yeah.
So part of what he comes to is that people have to start to see themselves as heroes in order to be able to step up and act like heroes when the moment actually comes. And I think this is something that I try to teach about and speak about a lot in Jewish context, is that there's this notion that, which I first learned from Dr. Barry Goldstein, who's here tonight, that this sort of waving a flag in front of you saying moral conundrum ahead, you're going to have an opportunity to do something and your whole life could be judged on it. Will you act like a villain or a bystander or a hero? Will you actually step up and engage properly? And it seems like what he's saying is it's essentially muscle memory, that if we imagine ourselves to be superheroes, eventually we'll be given the opportunity to engage heroically, and our bodies will and our spirits will kick in, and we'll be able to actually act like heroes. So I want to just put it out there and sort of offer it as a kind of closing thought for us. That perhaps, we're not just sort of watching these images on the screen, but actually called to, on some deeper level, start to, not wait for Superman or Batman or Spider-Man, but actually begin to take on some of the heroics ourselves, and hopefully it would help lead us to engage more courageously and more actively when we see the injustices that happen around us all too often. So I want to thank you so much. I'm really grateful to both of you. We have one of our staff people, Marnina, who's here somewhere tonight, has just been working so hard on this project for many months, and so thank you to Marnina. To Marina, who's outside, and I hope everyone will please stay for food and drinks. We hope you'll enjoy outside. And to Greg and Michael and Rose and Barry and all of those who helped prepare us for tonight. We have two other big events on the horizon that I just want to make sure you know about. Peter Beinart is coming to speak at Ikar on Wednesday night this week. Really extraordinary, provocative thinker on what's going on right now in Israel. And then we have Dan Ariely, who's an Israeli behavioral scientist and really, again, exceptional thinker who will be here on Sunday with us. So please, I hope you'll join us, and thank you all for being here tonight.